Welcome to my channel. This time I'm going to build a new serving tray. You might think it's unnecessary to build another serving tray, but the last one I built wasn't entirely successful when it came to the choice of wood. Mahogany and Purple Heart weren't a good combination at the bottom of the tray, because both got almost the same dark tone after varnishing. Rosewood and Purple Heart weren't a good combination either when the varnish was applied because the rosewood turned out darker than I expected. This also made it harder to see the 3D effect on the side panels. Now I'm trying again with a little lighter wood and a new pattern on the bottom of the tray and on the side panels. As usual when I build serving trays, I start with the bottom plate. This time the pieces will be 1.5 centimeters wide. I therefore start by cutting pieces that are 1.5 centimeters thick. Then I cut the pieces so that they measure 1.5 by 0.8 centimeters. The latter number is the thickness of the bottom without the 6mm plywood sheet that I plan to glue to the underside of the bottom. Here is all the wood that will be used for the bottom plate. This time it will consist of maple, beech, oak, and Purple Heart. Now it's time to cut all the rhombuses that will be used in the bottom plate. First, I set the sled to exactly 30 degrees and then the stop block to 1.5 centimeters from the saw blade. 1.5 centimeters is the same as the width of the pieces I cut. I start by cutting the ribs of the Purple Heart until I have 140 pieces. If the angle is set correctly, all pieces will be exactly 1.72 centimeters on all sides. Then I continue by cutting 60 pieces of maple, 60 pieces of beech, and 60 pieces of oak. Now I'm done with all the rhombuses. I continue cutting the small triangles. I keep the stop block in the same position as before. The only difference is that I rotate the bar between each cut. Here are all the pieces that need to be put together. From past experience, it will probably take a few hours to lay out the pieces in the right place so that they form the 3D figure I have planned. I start by forming a star in the middle and then try to build the figure out towards the edges. The reason why I have put together the small formations on the table is that I want to match the grain in the pieces as best as possible. I was very hesitant about whether I had made the right choice of wood this time. The aim was to get a clearer contrast between the dark purple background and the figure. However, there was a risk that the lighter woods would be too similar and the 3D effect would not appear. Now all the pieces of maple, beech, and oak are in place in the figure. Only the Purple Heart pieces remain. The pieces of beech and oak look quite similar in the camera, but it gets much better when the varnish is applied. Then you will see that the oak is darker and has more distinct grain. Finally finished. It took almost 3 hours to build the figure. Time to start gluing. I start by gluing together the pieces that form straight lines and build a 3D figure from these. The advantage of this is if the pieces are not perfectly even, I can sand their edges until they form a perfectly straight line. I've been gluing for 10 hours now. Even though it's going pretty slowly, a lot has been done on the first day. All the pieces of maple, oak, and beech are now glued together. Not much left. Finally, all the gluing work on the bottom plate is complete. It took me almost 17 hours to glue all the pieces together. To make the bottom plate a little more stable and make the underside nicer, I glue the plate onto a 6mm thick plywood sheet. I have chosen to make the side panels out of ash. Here's a simple drawing. I start by cutting a 50 centimeters long plank of ash into an 8 centimeters high piece. Then I continue cutting the piece into 3 1.4 centimeters thick pieces. Then I run the 3 pieces through the planer until the thickness is 1.2 centimeters. When the planing is finished, I cut the height of 2 of the pieces to 6.5 centimeters. This is the height of the 4 side walls that have no handle. Now it's time to cut the pieces to smaller lengths. First, I cut off the planer snips on the first and last piece I ran in the planer. Then I cut the 3 pieces so that I get 6 pieces that are 23 centimeters long. Here I have started cutting the inlays for the side panels. I started by cutting some scrap pieces I had into 3mm thick pieces. Then I continue by cutting the 3 mm thick strips to a width of 1 centimeter. Then it was time for the Purple Heart inlays. These were cut into 3 centimeters wide strips. When all the beech and walnut strips were finished, I continued cutting them into 3 centimeter long pieces that had a 45-degree angle at both ends. Here are all the pieces that will be used as inlays in the side panels. Time to start gluing the small pieces together into squares. This is what the squares look like when they are finished. And this is what the inlays look like when the pieces of Purple Heart are glued in place. Here I am milling grooves in the side panels. Before I started with the panels, I had run a test piece to be absolutely sure that the width of the groove corresponded exactly to the width of the inlays and that the depth of the groove was exactly the same as the thickness of the inlays. Finally, it's time to glue the inlays into the side panels. It is very tight, but it is better when it is tight instead of a gap when you're pushing the inlays into the side panels. Time to start with the handles on the higher side panels. I start by making a temporary drill jig and drilling 2 holes in the side panels, which will form the edges of the handles. Then I use the router to get exactly straight lines between the holes. I also mill round edges on the side panels. Since the inner part will be glued to the bottom plate, I only round the outside of the lower part. As usual, there were some burn marks on the outer ends of the handles, but after a little sanding by hand, the side panels look really good. This time I don't glue the side panels edge to edge with the base plate. Instead, I mill a recess in the side panels and make a flap on the base plate so that they fit together perfectly. Now all that's missing is the rounding on the top of the handles. Then the panels are complete. Since I don't have a bandsaw, I have to do the rounding by hand. But that works fine too, even if it takes a little longer. Finally, time to glue the side panels to the base plate. Then all that's left is a little sanding and applying varnish. Before I start varnishing with epoxy, I check that the serving tray is completely horizontal. This is important so that the epoxy will be evenly thick at the bottom of the serving tray. Now all you have to do is pour the epoxy into the bottom of the serving tray and brush it onto all the areas that need to be covered. The epoxy has a fairly high viscosity, so you can apply a fairly thick layer right away. In addition, the epoxy is self-leveling, so you don't need to worry too much about the bottom of the serving tray, except to brush the varnish all over the place. Still some air bubbles and dust particles. I remove the air bubbles with a heat gun and try to catch the dust particles with a screwdriver. Here is the final result. Not too bad, huh?